kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Verse 2, after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. I want to stop here for a second. In case you haven't brushed up on your first century economics, the denarius is actually like a silver coin for them. You might know the parable of the lost coin in Luke chapter 15, where the female has 10 coins and she loses one. Those were denarius, okay? So this denarius was also the standard for like a usual day's wage in this time and place, okay? Notice also the specificity of the word agreeing. Right? When you come to an agreement, there are always going to be multiple sides. So it's worth noting that when it says he was agreeing with the laborers to pay them a denarius, by the language used in this parable, we also can assume that the workers are going to be agreeing as well on the other side, right? That they were agreeing to this usual daily wage of denarius. So hold on to that. Scene change now in verse 3. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. This is starting to get a bit peculiar, right? One can assume this is a couple of hours later, but for some reason, the landowner returns to the marketplace to see some other potential workers there. It's worth noting that in this translation, standing idle, it doesn't exactly hit the connotation of the original Greek. There's this word here, agroi. It literally is translated as without work. Okay, so it's a subtle difference, but I want to see if we read through the rest of this where it says standing idle as without work. Right? Because maybe we're not meant to hear this as people just twiddling their thumbs in the middle of the marketplace without any care in the world, right? These people are already associated with work. They just currently are without it. Okay, so what does the landowner do when he sees these people without work in the marketplace? Verse 4, he says to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. And I love that last sentence. It's just so matter of fact. So they went. Like, no other details needed. They went. Hooray. Lowering unemployment rates, right? So, slightly different than our first scene. There isn't necessarily spoken agreement this time, but instead, the landowner says, "I will pay whatever is right." Now, that word right, in this instance, is another Greek word. We'll pull this up. It's dikaion. Dikaion has connotations of just, of fair, and of proper. Okay, so hold on to that one too. All right? Next scene now, verse 5. When he went out again at noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. All right, here's where it starts to feel a little odd, right? The man hires workers in the morning, then goes out another 4 times to hire more? What might this be saying about the landowner? Is he clueless about the amount of workers he might really need to tend his vineyard? Or does he constantly not have enough workers, so he has to go back and hire everyone available each time? Or could there be something hidden here, a hidden agenda to his actions, a method to his madness? That might be likely as well, but we don't have any clues yet as to what he's getting at. Because the parable doesn't mention of any need for labor at the time. There's also no explanation for why there continue to be individuals in the marketplace, but just not hired. So moving forward, he says to them, "Why are you standing here without work all day?" What does this question sound like to you? It can probably be easy to hear this as like a dig toward him, like, you've been in here all day and you still don't have work, right? But equally likely, and I think more provocatively, this could be a question of surprise, as though he's saying, y'all should be hired. Why hasn't that happened yet? And their response, they say to him, "Because no one has hired us." I like the bluntness of this, right? He says to them, "You also go into the vineyard." Do you see a pattern emerging here? Do you see the consistency in the response of the landowner? Okay, so that kind of sums up the first act, you might say, of this parable, right? The first act was setting up the groundwork, the characters and everything. And now we move on to another act. This is where things get interesting. So what's going to be the big conflict, the big surprise? All right? Here we go, Act 2. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." Okay, so nothing too weird yet. Maybe our ears perk up a little bit with the beginning with the last and going to the first part, but there are a variety of reasons why someone would choose to do that. We can't necessarily speak something into that yet. One other thing to point out is a translation observation here. When it says owner of the vineyard here, the word owner here is actually in the Greek kyrios, which literally translates as Lord. So maybe this is intentional now. Maybe Jesus is starting to direct the listeners to think about the nature of God as he finishes out this story. Okay, let's keep going. When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Interesting. Because isn't that the same amount of money that he promised the very first workers? Catch what comes next. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. What? Are you kidding me? Could you imagine? Right, and then this is their response. When they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." A little dramatic, wouldn't you say? Right? These first hired workers, they have some issues with this new deal that was dealt, and seemingly rightly so, right? But notice here how immediately this group wants to separate themselves from the rest. They try to pull rank. They don't want to be treated as equals with these other workers. They want to be treated better. Do you see and feel the tension rising here? And then how does the Lord of the vineyard respond? But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" Notice how the workers, they don't speak again. Perhaps they were left speechless. Because this rebuttal, he does have a point. Right? The landowner was not unfair. The first hired did agree on this earlier. And I love how Jesus ends this parable, like he does with multiple other parables, with a set of rhetorical questions. And it's so effective. Because, like the first hearers of the story, we are also left with the weight of these questions. And we're left to sit in that. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So that's the parable. What can we take away then? When we read this and we go through and notice these things and ask questions, staying curious, how then are we being challenged and invited into participating in God's kingdom? One thing to name is that when the title of the main character shifts to Lord of the Vineyard, it starts to lead us to see a little more about the character of God. And what is this revealing about God's character? God has a pretty surprising way of showing generosity. Right? I think one really great idea that's broken down in the story, this idea of what is right and just versus what is fair. Did you catch in verse 4, with the landowner promising to pay what is right? Right, this Greek word dikaion, that also means just, fair, proper. But then at the end, when the first hired, they begin to grumble at the landowner, he responds by saying he was not unfair to them. He was not unjust. Maybe this reveals to us that what God deems as just isn't necessarily what we think is appropriate. right? The workers were seeking what they perceived to be fair, but the Lord of the vineyard taught them a lesson by showing them what is just. And what God shows us is just is a display of generosity that defies our desire to be rewarded by the goodness of our behavior or our hard work. And to take it a step further, think about the implications of the landowner's specific measure of generosity. A denarius. This is a day's wage, a living wage. This is what one can assume about the amount of money that a person and their family needs to survive in this world. That's why it was the usual day's wage. So what is revealed through the parable about the landowner's concept of rightness and justice is that it is much less important for the workers to be paid based on the quality and the amount of their work, and much more important that the workers be paid enough to live another day. And this is consistent with a theme throughout the Bible of what it means to be just or to do justice. Right? It's to treat people and care for people in ways that value and honor the inherent value in every person, and then to act for their flourishing and their survival and thriving. Throughout the scriptures, the idea of being just or doing justice is evident. I don't normally condone listing out verses out of context in order to support a point, because this can and has been done pretty irresponsibly in some contexts, where verses are intentionally taken out of their original context, and then their meanings are construed away from how they were intended to be heard. This is a practice called proof texting, and I want to avoid it at all costs. I also hope that we can be mindful for when we might see someone else misinterpreting the heart of these scriptural passages. But that being said, I do want to share a few verses with you, intentionally because I believe in the context surrounding them, it does support this understanding of God's justice. And I encourage you to take note of them and look at the context yourself and see how does this play into this understanding of God's justice. Okay, so we're going to look at a few of them right now. The first one comes from Deuteronomy. It's in the Torah. These are the first 5 books of the Bible, the teaching or instructions from God to God's people, right? This is what God says in this. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land. Okay, so that's in the original teachings and instructions to God's people. Not only that, we hear it in prayers. We hear it in the book of Psalms. One particular prayer, it calls us to give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. That's Psalm 82 right here. And it's not only in that psalm, it's all throughout, but that one in particular, I really, it calls to me. We also hear it in the words of the prophets, right? These prophets, they were the folks who were essentially the mouthpieces of God. These were the ones who God called to declare God's message and vision to the people. And Isaiah is one of those prophets. He proclaims this: learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Right? These are just a handful of places where we see justice being shown in this way. If you want to dive deeper also into the concept of justice that is present throughout the scriptures, I also recommend you checking out the Bible Project's video on justice too, and it lays this out fairly well. Justice here is at the core of God's vision and desire for our world and our communities. Thus, it is an injustice for any person, due to the circumstances of their life, not to have the means to live abundantly and feel secure and safe. So, to do justice is to work toward this dream of making life livable for all. So what can we do with this? We see that the defining characteristic of God shown through this parable is generosity. And as we are invited to participate in God's vision of reality, right, God's kingdom, I think we are also meant to think again about our own idea of generosity. Think about the different sets of workers that show up throughout the parable. There was nothing different about them, except for the fact that somehow some were given the opportunity to work earlier in the day than others. Somehow their circumstances were different, and the ones who ended up getting hired later were at a disadvantage. When we look around our world today, we can see that life circumstances are different for everyone. Right? Our families look different. Our neighbors are different. Our neighborhoods are different. We might have access to different schools, different opportunities, face different challenges. Some of us might feel like life is easy. Another person right next to us might feel like life is really hard. But God's desire is to set this right, to show us what life can be like, free of inequities like this. Because what does Jesus' landowner do in the story? Regardless of the different circumstances of the workers, he had the means to provide what each of them needed to survive and thrive. So how do we hear ourselves in this story? I hope we can be challenged to think more like the landowner than the first workers, by letting go of what we think we deserve or are worth based on our comparisons with others, and instead seeing that all people should be given the tools and means to live life to its fullest. And I know that this story is fairly heavy on the economic side of things, because at the end of the day, in order for God's dream of all people to have abundant and full life to be a reality, they have to also have the means to survive in a world that has been shaped by the ethic of being rewarded for the productivity of our efforts. So to reverse this, we must think about our work and our labor, whether it's in the workforce or in God's kingdom. You have to think about that work not being for reward, but for the benefit of all. You might be someone who is well paid and feel very comfortable. You might be someone who is struggling, going from job to job, or the money that you make isn't exactly enough, and it's difficult to pay rent, feed your family or yourself. You might be someone in a position where you can make choices about the wages of your employees, or be part of those conversations. You might be someone who hasn't worked a day in 20 years, or you might be someone who hasn't worked a day in their life, But no matter your circumstances, your inherent value is still the same. And the challenge Jesus lays out here is that we express that value and love for one another through how we take care of one another. How do we make sure that each person and their livelihood is valued without discrimination or prerequisite? Because that is the generosity of God. So do you see how this is so much more than just a story? Just like this is so much more than just a story. Jesus teaches through stories because they connect to something already so important to those listening. And then he challenges them and challenges us to think again about what's important, to see through the eyes and the heart of God's desire for our lives. And then, here's the important part, he invites us to join God in the work of making that vision a reality. So yes, this story is about labor and wages, but it's also about God's way of justice. God's desire is for the flourishing of all humanity, and for us to participate in the bringing of that justice, of that flourishing. And how does Jesus reveal that? Through a story about labor and wages. So part of our challenge is asking this: how does this story of God's generosity and vision for humanity fit into our stories? How might we respond to Jesus' call to participate in God's story of justice, of caring for all of our siblings, of seeing the image of God in every person and making real, tangible choices because we do? Remember at the very beginning what parables set out to do? Right? To cast two stories side by side, Jesus' story and the story of our lives. We can do the same thing with any of these stories. But it takes work. It takes effort. It takes responsible listening and critical thinking. And when we do that, this becomes more than just a story. It's a conversation that we're invited to participate in, to be bold enough to challenge ourselves with, and also be bold enough to trust. God's not done telling the story. May we be willing to continue it. Amen.